It's time for our August blocks for the Civil War Sampler Program. This month, we're going to be doing 4 blocks. They are number 35, 37, 38, and 40 in your book. If you're working along with us, you have Barbara Brackman's Civil War Sampler book, and those are the numbers that correspond to the blocks in the book. Now this month, the blocks are a bit more challenging, but let's start with an easy one. We're going to start this month with block number 38, the railroad crossing. As you can see, it's a relatively simple block to put together. It has a center square, and we'll put it together in diagonal rows. The cutting instructions are a little bit different, and I wanted to simplify the cutting instructions, so I've changed the dimensions just a bit on all of the blocks that we're going to be doing this month. Barbara Brackman's instructions that are in the book ask you for piece number A, which is the corner triangle up here, to cut 2 7/8 inch squares. And then you're going to cut each in half diagonally 1 time. I have increased mine. I've increased mine to 3 1/4 as opposed to 2 7/8. And you'll see why in a minute. The B triangles, which are the 4 side triangles, those should be cut 5 1/4 if you're following Barbara's instructions. And Barbara's instructions are exact. I decided that I would rather enlarge this. So it's what I call the slop and chop method. You want to be able to sew some pieces together and then trim it up. I also wanted to make the C pieces a little bit easier to cut. So my B, I've enlarged to 6 inches, and you cut it diagonally twice. Every time you cut a square diagonally 2 times, the straight of grain is on the outside edge. So for the B triangles, the straight of grain will be on this side, and for the A triangles, it will be on the 2 shorter sides. That makes outside edge of our block the straight of grain, so we have no bias to work with. Now, for the C section, she has you cut 8 light and 4 medium rectangles, 1 1/2 inches by 3 3/8 inches. I decided I would rather round mine up to a more regular number than those 3/8 inch cuts. So what I did was cut the 2 outside, the light ones in this illustration, at 1 1/2, and the one in the center at 1 1/4. So the center piece on my block is slightly smaller. That means that the total dimension here is 3 1/4 inches, which is the size, the D, I cut. So it says 1 medium square, 3 3/8 inches. If you're using Barbara's dimensions, I went right to 3 1/4. That means that I'm changing the way the outside edge of my block will finish. You'll see what I mean, but let's put this block together first. Let's lay out our railroad crossing block. The 3 1/4 inch center square that I've cut is just a solid square for the center. And then I've sewn my 1 1/4 inch cut strip between my 2 1 1/2 inch cut strips. And then I've subcut those down into 3 1/4 inch squares. So all of these 5 pieces are the exact same size. Now I've taken my larger square of my background fabric, and those are going to go on each side like this. Once again, we cut them from 1 square, and by cutting diagonally, our straight of grain is on the outside edge. And you can see that these are much too large, so we'll have lots of area to trim. So I've sewn the 2 triangles to one of my pieced sections. I've sewn the piece sections to my center, and then the 2 triangles to this piece section. Then I went back and sewed them together. Now the seams that in this section I pressed out towards the background. Here I pressed them in towards the center, and there out towards the background. Now, when you sew your seams together this way, you can press them in either direction. I chose to press in. Now I'm ready to add my corner triangles. And as you can see, they're pretty much the right size. They don't look as oversized as the original triangles did, but that's because our block is oversized. In Barbara Brackman's version of the block, when you trim, you'll be trimming a 1/4 inch away from these points. And when you sew, this block will just fit. These will just touch. Where this is the block that I've already completed for my other quilt. And I think that you can see that I have a bit more than a 1/4 inch on all of my corners. So that means that when I trim this block down, this is my 8.5 inch ruler. When I trimmed it down, I took the centering lines right here, and all Creative Grids rulers have a centering line, and I lined them up in the center right there and trimmed around the outside edge. So my block is 8.5 inches, but I have a little bit more, about a 1/16 of an inch more than a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all sides. The same will happen with this block when I put these corners on and trim them down. So adjusting the cutting instructions made it a little bit easier for me to put together. So you can pause the video on that screen that I provided and write down my dimensions if you prefer to use those rather than the ones that are in the book. So now let's go to block 35, which is very similar to this one. If you enjoyed making block number 38, you're going to have no problem at all with block 35 because they are very similar. Before we get started, I want to point out to you that our block 35 Courthouse square has a pink tab on the top in my book. I put these tabs here to denote the blocks that are in our book, but not in the quilt that was featured on the cover. So in the very front inside cover of your book, this is the quilt that we're making. There are 50 blocks in this quilt, and there are 50 blocks in our book, but they are not the same 50 blocks. So as I was going through and deciding what order we would work in, I noticed that some of them in here were not necessarily in here, and I've noted those with the pink tab. So if you're trying to duplicate this quilt exactly and position your blocks in exactly the same place as they are in the original quilt, you're going to have to make some adjustments because not all the blocks that are shown here are featured in the book. Now, the block Courthouse square is very similar to our last block because you see the squares that are right there in our last block. We had the 5 squares that were the same size. In this one, we have 9 dark and 4 light, and they also are the same size. We've got our 4 corner squares, but in this case, for the Courthouse square block, we need 8 side triangles. I've made some adjustments to my cutting for this block as well, and I will give you the same blue screen that shows you exactly what changes I made. So you can pause the video and jot those down and make note of them in your book if you'd like to make those changes. Now, once again, all of the instructions that are right here, the cutting instructions, work perfectly, and your block will be the exact size it needs to be. But I know that some of you prefer to do what I call the slop and chop method and make things a little bit bigger and then cut them down. And I get a lot of questions about how do I know what I can cut larger and what I can cut down. Well, in this type of a block, anything that's around the outside edge can always be made larger because there's going to be a trim area for you. All of the blocks that are on the interior are the same size. So trimming around the outside edge is never a problem. So let's take a look at the changes I made, and I'll tell you why I chose to make those. For A, it says 2 light squares, 2 1/4 inches, and cut each in half diagonally to make 4 triangles. So we're going to do the same thing, but I have my A triangles at 2.5 inches. Now that gives you a little bit of extra play around the outside edge. If you prefer more, you can always go larger. Go to 2 3/4 inches. My B pieces, it says 2 light squares, 3 7/8, and then cut each in half diagonally twice to create 8 light triangles. Well, I would rather round those up a lot more. 3 7/8 is just 1/8 inch shy of 4 inches, but I'm going to 4 1/4 inches. And I'm doing that because I've actually changed the size of my C squares as well, and they're just a scant bit smaller. In C, you need 4 light and 9 dark that are cut 2 3/8 inches. I went down to 2 1/4, so I trimmed those down by 1/8 of an inch from what Barbara's suggestion is. That means that my patches sewn together are going to be slightly smaller, so I need that extra around the outside edge because these blocks will also float. If you follow Barbara's instructions, your block will look like this when you add the sashing. Your points of those squares will hit right on the seam line, so you won't have any chopped off points and your block will be square. In my case, your points are going to be slightly inside there, and you're going to have a little bit more background area that shows around the outside edge. So let's take a look at how we put this block together. Once you have your block arranged in the order that you would like your pieces to go together, we're going to be sewing together once again in diagonal rows. Now my corner piece, I've added triangle to each side. And just like before, when you have those triangles and they're much larger than they need to be, what you need to do is take your ruler, line it up like this, and trim those little triangles off. So they're kind of like giant dog ears. So now I can sew my rows together. So this row to this to this, add these all together, and on my square will be assembled except for my corner triangles. Now once I've sewn those together, I'll have some dog ears to take care of here as well, but then I can put my corners on. So I will have 4 corners that go like this. Now the pressing of your seams in this particular block is very easy because just press towards the dark. So these will go in, those will go out, these will go in. So to press towards all of the colored squares and away from the background, and all of your seams will nest. So I've just finished assembling my Courthouse square block, and I realized that my 4 1/4 inch dimension, I increased that, but I could have increased it even more. It was just barely enough to get my 8 1/2 inch square out. So instead, you'll see that I've increased it on your blue screen to 4 3/4 inches. And I used that dimension for my second block, and I was much happier with the ability to trim around the outside edge. Up next is block number 37, which is called Fort Sumter. Once again, I've made some adjustments to the cutting instructions, so you'll get a blue screen after we discuss it, which will outline my changes. So in Barbara's book, the cutting instructions say, A, you need 4 red rectangles. And she stipulates that these are red rectangles to reference the color in the diagram here. Obviously, yours can be any color that you would like, but you see that they're no longer rectangles, because if you read further, it says, when you're finished piecing the block, you'll square up the block, and those will be trimmed along the outside edge. But they are cut as rectangles. That means that just this little edge that's here and here are going to be on the bias on the outside edge of our block. You're going to need 4 of those, and Barbara has them cut 2 1/2 by 3 1/2. I went ahead and increased mine to 2 1/2 by 3 3/4 because having extra dimension this way is not a problem. We'll be trimming, but we don't want to make it any wider or we'll have to adjust these triangles as well. Now your B triangles, you're going to need 8 of them to go around the outside edge. So you're going to cut 2. I cut mine 4 inches. You may want to cut yours larger than that. You'll see why in a minute. But hers, the blue squares, she's referencing the color here, she cut 3 7/8 inches. That's the exact measurement if you want your block to be the exact right size. I rounded up to 4, which gave me a little bit of extra space on there, but you may want to go to 4.5 with your square, and then it's going to be cut twice. Each square will yield 4 triangles, so you're going to need 2 of them to get your 8 side triangles for B. For C, it says 4 light squares, 1.5 by 1.5. These are those small corner squares that go here. And then for D, you'll need 4 dark rectangles that are 1.5 by 4 1/8 inches. I left those measurements the same. So my rectangles are 1.5 by 4 1/8. The reason they're the same is because of this center square E. You need 1 medium square, 4 1/8 inch square. Now, it's a perfect place to show off a fun type fabric. So let's lay this block out, working from the center out. We're going to build our Fort Sumter block working from the center out. So this larger print fabric is my center square that was cut 4 1/8 inches. And then I've sewn to either side of that one of the rectangle strips that's 1.5 by 4 1/8. Now next, before I sew the additional pieces on, I'm going to want to add my corner squares to each one of those, and then this will be ready to be attached. And I can do that on both sides. Once those are sewn together, you have choices for how you're going to press your seam allowances. I think of these green pieces as sashing, so I press towards the sashing. So these were pressed out, and these will be pressed out. But this means that's pressed in, so that this seam goes out and those seams go in, so that all of your seams will nest. Then it's time to make your corner units. And we're going to take those rectangles that Barbara refers to as red in the listing and sew a triangle on either side, keeping the base even down here. And then when you sew those together, you're going to put them on all 4 sides of your center block. So they're going to be added like this. The one thing that you have to take care of when adding these is that it is exactly centered. So once this block is assembled, fold it in half and mark the center on all 4 sides. Then fold this unit in half, matching the seams here. So you want to match those seams, match and pinch that to mark it, and then match that to the center here, so that all of these are in the right position and they line up centered on all 4 sides. Now, this is the block that I've assembled for my other quilt, and you can see, scoot these over here so that you can see that the pieces are a little bit larger than they need to be, and we're ready to trim our corners. Now, I increased the size of some of my pieces, but I would feel more comfortable if I had increased them even more. On this block, I increased the rectangle to 3 3/4 over here, and I only did 3.5 here. And you'll see when we trim, this is my 8.5 inch square, and if I line this up, there are white centering lines on all of the Creative Grids rulers. So if I line that up and center that, you'll see that by cutting it Barbara's dimension of 2.5 by 3.5, all of my corners are exactly on point. I increase them over here an additional 1/4 inch, so you have a little more to trim off. Also, these triangles that are here, I cut them at 4 inches and cut them in half diagonally twice. If you like more than just that little bit to trim off around the outside edge, you might want to increase them to 4.5. That way you'll have a little bit more fudge room around the outside edge. But once you have all of those pieces together, then you want to line this up like this, match your crosshairs so that everything is lined up properly, and you will have an exact 1/4 inch on all 4 sides on this block. There is no float. Our last block for August is block number 40, which is called Texas Tears. And to be perfectly honest with you, this block could bring you to tears. I know that some of you have been quilting and piecing for a long time, and you're up for this challenge. But I also know that some of you kind of jumped into this sew-along, not really knowing what you were getting into. This is one of those blocks where you might want to try it because it's a challenge, but you also might want to just skip this one and substitute any other 8-inch block in your quilt. Because as I pointed out earlier, not all the blocks that are in the book are actually in the quilt, and not all the blocks in the quilt are actually in the book. So if you pull a block from someplace else, that's perfectly fine. But if you're up for a challenge, follow Barbara's instructions in the book, and I'll show you how to put this together. Now let's talk about the changes that I made so that I could get through this block. So for A, it says 2 light squares. She wants you to cut them 3 9/16, which she mentions is just under the 3 5/8 on the ruler. Well, if you've invested in the itty-bitty rulers, you'll have those 1/8 inch markings along the side here. So those black diamonds are actually 1/4 inch apart, and there are white diamonds in between them, which mark every 1/8 inches. We're going to be dealing with 1/16 inches, so that's halfway between that black and white diamond. So it's some pretty fine cutting that you're going to be doing. Instead of cutting them 3 9/16, I'm doing mine 3.5. Now I realize that's smaller, but there's a reason for that. Now B, 1 light and 2 dark squares, 3 15/16. That's 1/16 inch less than 4 inches. I went ahead and rounded up on mine. 4.5 is what I'm cutting. And those will get cut twice so that you get 4 triangles from each square. So my B triangles are the side triangles. That A triangle is my 4 corners. So those are getting cut once. On C, you cut 1 medium square 5 1/4 inches, which would be easy, but I rounded up to 5.5 because we're going to square up that center section. And then for D, it's 1 dark rectangle, 1 7/16 by 8 3/4. I made mine 1.5 by 9, much easier. And then 2 dark rectangles, 1 7/16 by 4 1/4. I made mine 1.5 by 4.5, which is plenty big enough. This is also one of those blocks where you're going to build from the center out. So we're going to do that center block with the X first, and then build our sides along with it. So let me show you how I put mine together. Mine's going to look a little different than Barbara's. One of the things that you'll see is that, let's look over here on the color pictures. When you look at the color pictures, you see this band that goes through the center that forms that X. The reason it's called Texas Tears is because when you put the triangles on, it makes T's. So T for Texas. But if you look at how those points come together, they meet right here. Mine don't. You'll see how I've done that. Let's put it together, working from the center out. The first thing that we're going to do to assemble this block is take the large square. This is the 5.5 inch square that I cut. We cut it diagonally twice that created these 4 triangles. We're going to sew those on either side of one of the 1.5 by 4.5 strips that we cut. Now I enlarged mine, so that's different than the way the book has. And you'll get a blue screen for my cutting instructions as well. But when you sew them together, you're going to sew one on either side. You want to keep this base even here so you have a nice straight line. So do that twice, and then you can press your seams in either direction. It doesn't really matter for this, but I pressed mine out. So now what I want to do is take this particular section, and I'm going to center it on my other piece, my other strip here, and sew across here. Once that's sewn, I'm going to make sure that this piece lines up exactly with that piece because we want them directly across from one another. You don't want to make sure that they're not off-centered. So let me get those sewn together, and then we'll be ready to put the outside edges on. Now that I have my center square sewn together, I've trimmed it, and in my case I've trimmed it to 5 1/2 inches. So you notice that my center lines line up, and now I'm ready to put my side triangles on. For the side triangles, you have to sew these 3 together and make sure that you have a straight line across the bottom. Now, I know that many of you have been sewing for a long time, so you're comfortable just judging when you put these 2 together. You can judge that seam allowance that's along there. But for some of you who are just beginning, you might want to mark the seam allowance the way that you can see that I've done here. Put a pin right through that seam where those 2 lines cross. You get it lined up properly here. And then do the same thing on this side. So we're going to line this one up like that. Let's move it over there. You can see where this can be tedious to get done. Now we want to line those up like that so that I have a dog ear on each end. And then we're going to pin them together and go sew on that side. When that one's sewn together, then you'll do the same thing to add this one. So it'll be 2 darks with 1 light in the middle. And it's going to look just like this. What you're looking for is the 3 triangles sewn together with a straight edge along here and a 1/4 inch seam allowance from that point to the outer edge. Then this is going to be sewn on here on opposite sides. Now on Barbara's block, scoot these up so you can see them. On Barbara's block, this unit is going to fit that base exactly. On mine, it doesn't. Mine's a little larger than it needs to be, and we're going to trim here on the edge. But once again, we want to make sure that this point is centered right with those lines. So I'm going to put those together, and we'll sew them on either side. So I've added my side triangles to the top and bottom edge, making sure that my points all line up. And then I've trimmed the dog ears that were left here on the corners so that I have a straight edge on the right and left side. That's going to allow me to add my other sides to my block like this. Once again, I'll make sure that they stay centered on each side. Then I can go ahead and add my corner triangles the same way that we've added our corner triangles for the other blocks like this, and I'll have my 8 1/2 inch square. Now this is the block that's finished for my other quilt. And you'll notice that, as I mentioned before, see the extra, the tops of my tees are a little extra wide compared to what Barbara's would be. If you use her measurements, you're going to come out with your 1/4 inch, which I will have on this block as well, but your tee, the top of your tee, will be a little bit different size. It would look more like that, where this corner point right here would meet that seam right there. So our tees are just a little beefier than Barbara's are, but I do think those measurements are a little bit easier to cut. So you'll get another blue screen listing all of the changes that I made in your Texas Tiers block. And then we've completed the 4 blocks for August for our Civil War sew-along.